Mr. Francis Ebejer, a notable Maltese writer of plays and prose, but perhaps you better introduce yourself.
Well, I write, first of all, in both languages, in my own language, Maltese, and in English. Practically all my novels except one are in English, and they've been published in London, New York, and locally. I've got one novel in Maltese. In Maltese, largely it's plays, stage plays, radio plays, and television plays, although I've got some, about 13, that are in English. I've been writing since I was 9. I mean, it started as a hobby. I used to have a football team of the quarters where I lived, that's Rabat. They used to promise my team I'd write them a short story about cowboys if we won. And it wasn't a hobby at all, it was a compulsion, I discovered later. It was in me, I had to write. Yes, it was in me.
Yes.
You know, at first you think it's a hobby like collecting stamps or marbles, something that will die off as you grow older. But this thing became stronger and stronger as I went along, and I couldn't do without it, even though it's hard work. Sometimes I wish I didn't have it, but there's some satisfaction in it, despite of the hard work.
And you've never looked back, so as the saying goes.
Well, not really, no, because I'm still active, I'm 68, and I'm not writing big, or shall we say, long works now, like 3-act plays or full-length novels as I used to. But I keep my hand at it, and I've had my work, as I said, published abroad, and I had a play recently on German radio, VDR of Cologne, and Dutch radio have broadcast some of my short stories, same as with the BBC, quite a number. Because I write short stories too. I've had so many published in America besides locally. And I keep my hand at things. I'm writing quite a number of short stories at the moment. And at the same time, giving interviews like this and making sure, or rather, that people abroad, outside Malta, would know there's something like this going on in Malta. There's quite an active Maltese literature, you know,
Yes.
that our literature is comparatively young. And as you know too, our language has always been written in the Roman alphabet. So I broke quite a few lances on behalf of our own literature, with plays largely at the Malta Theatre, and now recently on television too.
You've got a television play going on now.
No, but I've had even serious. In fact, they tell me that I anticipated Dallas, of course, of a different standard, because I wrote a kind of Dallas-like serial in,
Really?
in Little Malta in 1977, which went on for 3 months. The street used to be empty when it was on, and Dallas came afterwards. I mean, but not Dallas, the same of kind of sharing guns going on between people with certain psychological interest and also philosophical interest. Story.
Do you know whether Television Malta have got any archives where this series would be on tape?
I'm afraid I was going to say, I'm ashamed to say that they were not very, in the old days, they were not very particular. They used to have these spools, you know, and throwing them in a room with, I mean, no consideration to temperature of the room. And
Quite so.
so, honestly, I don't know what has survived, or what has been lost, or what has been stolen. I've got no idea whatsoever.
I should think that would be
There might be
Maltese
something.
television history is quite.
Yeah, I know, but they take more care now, apparently. But strangely enough, a lot of good work used to be done on our television when it was still new, still black and white, and very little money, much more than is being done now, I would say. And there are more amenities, more equipment, and so on. It reminds me of the time when the neorealism school of film started in Italy, before the dollar stepped in. They used to produce those fantastic films on a shoestring
That's
budget.
right. Yeah. Perhaps they were
like
more.
Roma Aperta and Bicycle Thieves, which I would say, or Antonioni's film, which I would say haven't been superseded by the Italian film, except perhaps lately with Cinema Paradiso, which won an Oscar for the producer about 2 years ago, I would say. Sometimes they show short farces that they had managed to salvage from the past. But there isn't a consistent kind of policy behind it yet.
Yeah. You write a lot of your work in English. What is the percentage or approximate percentage of your work that's been sold abroad then?
Well, I mean, some of my books have been sold in larger quantities than have been in Malta. I'm not a bestseller. I mean, let's make this plain. I'm not a Harold Robbins or Judith Krantz. But I'm quite perfectly satisfied. And one good thing about my work, because most of my novels are based on Malta, Maltese customs, characters, traditions, history.
Yes, good.
So they remain a kind of a recurrent, they retain a recurrent interest in the sight of visitors to Malta, you see. So any visitor who's never been to Malta would come and say across a book of mine which I wrote and had published 10, 12 years ago. For him or her, it's new. So they are permanently on the shelves, let us say. So there isn't they don't suffer from shelf age. Yeah, for the Maltese, yes, because if some Maltese who goes into a shop and sees one of my books, say, "Oh, that I read that 12 years ago." But for a visitor from Malta, many of our tourists, of course, speak English, including Finnish people, Germans, and the British, of course. For them, it's discovering something new and dealing with the country they have visited, in which perhaps they are slightly interested and would like to know more. So there we sell a few copies. Paradoxically speaking, being inhabitants of a very small island, right in the center of the Mediterranean, one would expect to be a lot of insularity here, an inward-looking kind of temperament. There is that, but also we do look out of our island. And what has helped, paradoxically again, has been colonization. We've been colonized for almost all our history, up till 1964, which is only yesterday, about 18 years ago. Is that 18? 28 years ago. And people ask me sometimes, would tourism make any difference? Or I said, I don't think so. I don't think they're going to damage our way of life or culture, because we've been used to tourism all our history, because colonialism was a kind of tourism. All right, we didn't used to see so many Finns or Germans in the streets of Sliema. We used to have loads and thousands of British service dependents, like wives and children. And we happen to have been a British colony, so English was taught in the schools and still is, as an obligatory language with Maltese. So to us, the foreigner is not something out of the blue, not a sudden intruder. We've been living cheek by jowl with foreigners, and there have been a lot of mixed marriages. You yourself is a case in point, and I was, and my sisters are, you know, one is married to a Dutchman and another one to an Englishman. So there is milieu of cultures. Apart from the language, there's also the culture, a mixture of cultures. Now, there is a basic Maltese culture, which we guard very, very closely. But it's a kind of culture, fortunately, that has always been ready to absorb what we thought might be the best for it from other cultures. North-South, you know, Malta is a frontier situation. It's right in the middle and on the point, on intersection of North, South, East, West influences right from the dawn of our history. And it still is. And that has helped to, for better or worse, make us the people that we are. We're full of faults, like everybody else, and sometimes we wish certain faults we didn't have, but we're all human beings. But On the whole, and I'm being quite roseate, sanguine about this, on the whole, it's been a good influences, cultural influences and language influences coming in constantly, not only now through tourism and television, because we get, as you know, CNN every day, and we get Italian television.
About 20 channels of Italian television?
About 20 Italian stations. But we have managed to retain quite a lot of our native characteristics. I must say, I'm being very, very objective when I say this. We have, fortunately. And of course, everything that ties everything up for us is the language, which is pretty strong. There have been attempts to suppress it, but fortunately those attempts failed. And our language, which is, I would say, 70-75% of Semitic origin, and the rest 25% of Romance origins, is pretty healthy, and is being spoken more and more.
People who are basically Maltese speaking have the impression, right or wrong, that people who speak English in Malta may be not quite as honest, that they cannot speak Maltese or understand Maltese. But I've discovered as time went by that this is actually a fact, that people who speak English at home all their lives don't have a very good basic Maltese. And having so many Italian channels, that many youngsters are learning Italian freely in a way, and their English is not so good. How do you see it now?
Well, that has been a problem. There's a snobbish element in this. Some families, in the old days more especially, in the very old days, used to be Italian. Italian was the language of the court of society, as French was once in England. French had the same kind of stature in England. I mean, to be something, to show you cultured, not one of the hoi polloi. You had to speak French, and you had to speak Italian. But the war put paid to that, and English took over, as it is taking over all over the world, I would say. And I'm all for English, all for our children learning English, but I'm against, but not at the expense of our language. In other words, you could love another language. I've been writing all my life in English, but that doesn't mean I sniff down on my own language. My parents were both educationists, and they loved all literatures, Italian, English, they loved them all, and Maltese. My father, in fact, was one of the first pioneers of modern Maltese grammar and orthography back in the 1920s, when Britain gave us the first self-government constitution in 1921. And they always made it a point that we spoke Maltese, because Maltese parents, and it's also natural, because it's like your living of your mother's milk. Your mother's milk is Maltese. And for the building up of concepts, mental concepts, very, very important, the mother tongue. And then English would come willy-nilly. There's no problem at all. But some people think they'll never learn English unless they spoke to them in English all the time, which is a great fallacy, apart from the fact that sometimes, we all know, psychologists tell us that the first years of a child's life are his formative years. So if a child of, say, Maltese parents is spoken to in English that does not very good English, because the parents might not be all that up to proper English, they have broken English with certain childish intonation. Some people grow up still with that childish intonation. So I've got a son married, and we've got 4 children. I'm glad they speak Maltese, but they are picking. I mean, boy is 7, the girl is 5, and they are picking English as they go along very, very, very easy. There isn't a problem. I think it was largely a classist kind of approach, mostly snobbish. In other words, speaking English or Italian in the old days to cut yourself off from the common, so-called common people. Although that doesn't hold much anymore. No.
How can you feel you can express yourself best? That is, when you're angry, do you say something in Maltese or in English?
Well, that is very, very interesting. Only last year I had some neighbors living, I live alone, as you know, living next door, and they had the second child, was one of those classic examples of children who cry all day and all night long in the first 3 months of their lives. Because I spoke to doctors, friends of mine, they say such babies do exist. For no reason whatsoever, a child cries and cries and cries for the first 3 months. Whether he's missing the planet he should have gone to and made a mistake coming here, I don't know. But these are people who spoke English all the time among themselves. The husband and wife, Maltese, speak English, 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 English. But many a night, she used to wake me up. I mean, I could hear the woman getting up to silence the child, if possible. And then that stress of not sleeping enough, of hearing her child cry, she expressed herself in Maltese. She went back to the mother tongue, the gutsy, the grassroots sentiments, like in Maltese. In other words, why are you doing this to me, my child, in Maltese? Because she was desperate, you see.
Quite so, yes.
In other words, like people who spoke a foreign language all his life, he came to dire straits, like drowning, or he needs help. I'm sure he'll express himself in Maltese.
Yes,
His mother tongue is a cliche, but it's very true.
Well, one thing that came up in your a few minutes ago now, when you were mentioning how good it is that Maltese have had these tourists for thousands of years. Modern Europe seems to be having difficulties with its identity because of so many foreigners coming to the country, and neo-Nazism is raising its ugly head again. How do you see that in relation to the situation in Malta?
Well, at the moment there's a polemic going on whether we should enter Europe fully or partly or none at all. People are split in this matter, and sometimes when you look at Europe at the present moment, it's a bit of a shambles, and one is slightly disheartened, because instead of unity, all we can see happening around is fragmentation. It's starting in the Balkans. I mean, it was years and years and years that we had last heard of Sarajevo and the Balkans and Bosnia. There were names that had disappeared after the First World War. They're coming back, the fragmentation. There is no chance of us being fragmented like that. We're too small to be fragmented, except in our minds. Some people think it's a good thing to be full members, others half members. Personally, I'm not so sure what is the best for us. On the other hand, one has to be pragmatic in a very pragmatic sort of world, and we can't really exist on our own, like something dangling in space. We have to be either on one side or the other. Especially for security purposes, not just trade. So I think it would be best for us to join Europe. Then, of course, I think that's where the danger of assimilation comes in. The danger that we are escaping, the danger posed by tourism when you said that we might be too assimilated, losing our identity. It hasn't happened, or I don't think what happened will happen through sheer tourism. But I think if we become members of Europe, I mean, what's stopping us from becoming an appendage of Sicily, for instance, let's say? Yes. And we hadn't been an appendage of Sicily. We would have been an appendage of Sicily if the British never took us over. I think one of the two lucky things happened in our history. First, St. Paul being Christianized by St. Paul. And secondly, that the British, good old Nelson, took us over when he was after Napoleon. We have to thank Napoleon again. If that hadn't happened, I think it would have been just an island off Sicilian shores, as Pantelleria or Lampedusa.
But how was Napoleon's rule to do with Sicily? Was that? Do you see it as Napoleon would have, France would have kept Sicily somehow? Or?
Oh, it does. I mean, the French had occupied us from 1798 to 1800, when the French started being very good. In fact, in the short time Napoleon was here, he introduced elementary education for all, which was very good, and gave us his law, which we still follow with the English. But his men started being a bit bloody with us, and robbing our churches and so forth. And one fine day, there was a group of Maltese patriots. They chose a very dark night. They knew Nelson ships were blockading the French fleet here. They went out to the open sea and asked Nelson to come and help us drive the French out. And Nelson thought it was just a little skirmish, drive them out before the Battle of the Nile. And he liked the place, so our natural harbors, absolutely, Malta in the center of the Mediterranean Sea, and the British remained, having been invited by us. We were not occupied as such. We were invited the British to stay. So that was the fact that Nelson came down this far south was thanks to Napoleon in a sense. If that didn't happen, I think we'd just be a very tiny blot in the Mediterranean, inaccessible to Sicily or Libya or anything else. Well, like this gave us added to our identity, you see. Again, paradoxically, our history is full of paradoxes.